Friends, I'm afraid we have finally reached a tragic milestone, and that is, I've been in a reading slump for 6 whole months. My last reading wrap-up was back in April, and in that reading wrap-up, I spoke all about how I was really struggling with reading, struggling with booktube in general for a whole host of reasons. In April, I only managed to read 5 books, which sounded like almost nothing to me back then. If only I knew then how bad it would get. Obviously, everybody reads at different paces. 5 books in a month is not objectively a low number, but it's certainly very low for me and what I've been used to reading over the last few years. In January this year, I read over 25 books, and then in February and March, I think I read about 15 books each in those months. So dropping down to just 5 felt quite drastic. However, in the 5 months since April, I think I've read less than 15 books total. But I mean, 15 or so books is not a number to sneeze at entirely. So I thought today we could do a wrap up, except instead of a monthly wrap up, it's like the last 5 months wrap up. I would say the biggest chunk of books that I have been able to get through consistently are the books that we read in my book club over on Patreon. 3 of these are non-fiction, and I think obviously having like a deadline and an external expectation that I read a book has definitely been the push that I've needed to get through these books. Equally though, with my book club, I always make sure, I do my best to make sure that there is an audiobook available for any of the books that we read, just to make the book club that little bit more accessible, obviously to other people, but also it helps me when I'm in a reading slump. So I have definitely been very heavily relying on audiobooks for these book club books, but also for a lot of the other books we'll talk about too. So the books that we have read for the book club, the first one was Beyond Survival, Strategies and Stories from the Transformative Justice Movement. As somebody who has only ever read one other book on transformative justice, I do feel like this was a pretty solid kind of like next step for me to read personally. I do really like how this book is broken down into so many sections, and there's a lot of contribution from a whole lot of different people from across kind of like North America, I would say mostly, talking about and exploring their own personal experiences, kind of like organizing or being a part of transformative justice in their communities. And we have people from a whole range of different backgrounds who are organizing in very different ways. And so I think that was probably my favorite part of the book, just kind of hearing from so many different voices, so many different perspectives about what transformative justice can look like, what it can achieve, some of the limitations and like issues people have bumped up against, and I suppose the lessons learned through failures. So while I liked an awful lot about this, and I did find it both really interesting and also just, I don't know, I suppose it broadened my perspective in a lot of ways, I would say this is one of those books that I wasn't always sure like who it was for. Sometimes for some of the contributors, it did feel like they were more like, I don't know, pontificating about or like justifying some of the decisions they made to like people who have criticized them within the transformative justice community. It felt a little insular at times, I suppose. So I don't know. I suppose what I'm saying is I really liked reading this book. I really liked that we read it as a book club. We got to have a really great chat about it. I think the next book that we read as a book club was one of the few fiction books, and I think only one of 2 young adult books we've ever read together. It was The Snake Falls to Earth by Darcy Little Badger. My words today. And although this is young adult, it has a level of like whimsy to it that I think does make it feel a little bit middle grade. I honestly have to admit that in the few months since I read this book, I don't remember all the details, so we don't know how thorough a review I will be able to give. But essentially in this story, we meet a young girl who has grown up with her great-grandmother, who is this very old woman telling amazing stories of how Earth used to be, how Earth and the spirit realm used to kind of coexist. But since humans have proved themselves essentially unworthy and in so many ways just like too dangerous, the spirit realm has detached from Earth, and so now all of like the animal spirits kind of live in their own spirit realm. And basically this is a story about the human world and the spirit world kind of like colliding again for the first time. And it specifically takes a really spiritual, beautiful, quite powerfully moving look at extinction and how damaging and harmful it is, obviously not just to the individual animal that is being made extinct, but through a spiritual lens looks at kind of like the ripple effects of extinction. I really liked a lot of the characters in here, and it did really feel entrenched in like Indigenous storytelling, the way that we kind of like weave through a few different narratives. I liked all of that, and I really just liked the atmosphere and the world building. I think where this book fell a little flat for me was just in terms of like, I suppose the plot, not the main plot. I thought the main plot was really effective, but there was a couple of subplots that didn't always feel necessary to the overall project of the book and didn't always like tie together at the end in a way that felt satisfying, in a way that felt like justified the existence of the subplot. So sometimes I suppose it felt a little needlessly convoluted in a way that wasn't satisfying. Having said that, I still really enjoyed reading it. Like I said, the atmosphere to it and whimsy, but like there's also this wistful emotional resonance throughout the book too that was really powerful. The next book we read in the book club is We Could Have Been Friends, My Father and I, a Palestinian memoir by Raja Shahade. Now, if you've been around here for a little while, you'll know that I have read a couple of Raja Shahade's books now, particularly Palestinian Walks and Going Home, are two of my favorite nonfiction books that I've ever read. As with those two books, essentially this is a mix of memoir, history, politics, something that I think Raja does better than almost any author I've ever read from, kind of really blurring the lines between all of those apparently distinct genres. However, where Palestinian Walks and Going Home, like the kind of main, I don't know, like the center heart of the book was walks. So we got a lot of nature writing as well. In this book, Raja is instead reflecting on his father's legacy and his father's life. His father was murdered in 1985 and he was also a lawyer. So Raja and he had a lot in common, but they never really met eye to eye. They butted heads a lot while he was alive. And so here, Raja is not only learning about his father and kind of like his political activism, which is essentially, you know, the generation before Raja's, which we learnt more about in Palestinian Walks and Going Home. But we're also watching Raja as he like kind of interacts with and then like re-stories his understanding of his father and their relationship. So yes, we get the incredibly powerful, really direct history lesson essentially about Palestine during this time. We also get some really intimate moments of Raja just learning about his family, and in particular his father, and some really vulnerable moments of Raja kind of confronting the views that he had of his father while he was alive, and, you know, his own stubbornness, his own arrogance, and how in so many ways that kept them apart, despite the fact that they had a lot in common and maybe they could have been friends. I'm getting emotional. This is a very, very short book, but as with all of Raja's work, it just fucking hits, man. It hits so hard. He just really has a knack for delivering really big moments in history, really big concepts in very direct, clear ways. And while he's direct and clear, he never skimps on the emotional resonance and like the emotional truth of what he's talking about. I genuinely think he's one of the greatest writers that I've ever read from, particularly in the nonfiction kind of sphere. What he is able to do in such a short volume, I will just never get over. I am in awe. And then last month we read We're All Neurodiverse by Sunny Jane Wise. This is a nonfiction book talking about neurodiversity, neurodivergence, and autism. In particular though, this book is not like so much a memoir or a discussion of a particular lived experience of neurodivergence. Instead, Sunny Jane Wise is more looking at neurodiversity paradigm as opposed to more pathology paradigms. So challenging essentially how we view neurodiversity in the population at large. And in so doing, obviously that extends to challenging a whole host of systems such as capitalism. I do feel like this is a really great introduction to that more kind of like holistic neurodiversity paradigm. It's very readable. It's broken down in very kind of like obvious sort of ways. And I genuinely liked a lot about this book. I underlined a lot. I have like little love hearts and plenty of the margins. The way Sunny kind of spoke about neurodiversity and neurodivergence, the way that they brought in very intentionally other movements such as civil rights and the disability justice and all of that good stuff, I really liked. However, I did feel like this book was definitely heavily relying on the work of some other people that I have read from. In particular, it felt kind of like a more accessible, or you could read in a less generous way, a watered down version of Neuroqueer Heresies by Nick Walker. And Nick Walker is somebody that Sunny references a lot. So it's not that it's without attribution. It didn't always feel like Sunny kind of went the next level of like adding a whole lot, if that makes sense. The other thing I will say is that this felt very American centric, despite the fact that Sunny is Australian. It felt very rooted in an American kind of discussion around neurodivergence, around disability, around racial issues as well. And so I suppose the fact that Sunny is Australian and yet it had such a very specific American flavor, it just felt like a little clumsy sometimes. It just felt a little confused sometimes. And I think that that would be my biggest critique overall. Like I said, I really enjoyed reading it. I'm really glad that we got to read it. And I do feel like this is a really solid introduction. It's very accessible in terms of the way that it's written and the way that it's structured. A good solid book that I'm glad we read, but wouldn't necessarily be on the top of my recommendations list if I ever do another one of my autism book recommendations in the future. Okay, so those are all the books that we read for my Blossom Book Club in the last few months. Now onto the books that I read in my own time. Actually, let me start with the books that I don't have here because otherwise I will forget them. The ones that I don't have here are all children's or young adult graphic novels that I borrowed from work, so I don't have a lot to say about them. We'll go through them quickly. The first one was Monty and Leo, a newcomer in Pocketville. I fucking loved this book. This is like a junior fiction, I'd say like 7+ maybe, little graphic novel. It was sweet as hell. I did actually read this in a reading vlog, and basically it's about this little town where everything is very kind of like predictable, but then a newcomer moves in. And in particular, our main character Monty is not thrilled about it. But essentially Monty learns pretty quickly that Leo and he have a lot in common. So like, maybe they could be best friends. The next one was a junior fiction chapter book, actually. It wasn't a graphic novel, called The Pinchers and the Diamond Heist. And this was a story basically about a family of robbers. And it was funny, but it wasn't as funny as I was hoping it would be. It was cute though. Basically, I think it was the son couldn't lie, and so he kept getting his family into trouble. Then I read actually a young adult graphic novel. It was called Thieves, and this is queer sapphic to its core. It's basically about a girl who just like steals shit at parties, and while she's kind of reckoning with that, she's also falling in love. People love this graphic novel, and I did really like the art style, but I don't know, I suppose the whole conceit of just like stealing shit, it just didn't do a lot for me. It was fine. It was fine. And then another kind of like middle grade junior fiction graphic novel that I read is Detective Beans and the Case of the Missing Hat. This is just about a cat who's a detective and he's on the search for his hat that he's lost. It was kind of cute. The illustrations are great. It was quite funny too. Detective Beans is a great main character. It wasn't my favorite graphic novel though. Now on to the books that I do have here. While we were up in Queensland, I actually found at Lifeline Cosima Unfortunate Steals a Star, which is a book that we do stock from time to time at work, and in particular one of my colleagues has read and really loved it and recommended it to me a little while ago. But it's a book that she loves to hand sell, so I always feel bad like purchasing the copy that we have. So it's taken me a little while to get around to it. So when I found it at Lifeline for just $4, of course I had to pick it up. Essentially, this is like the classic middle grade orphan story, but it's set like in historic times. When's it set? I don't know. I don't know that it specifies, but like I would say something in like the 1800s kind of vibe, you know? But here, instead of just being at a regular old orphanage, we are actually at a home for, what do they call them? The Unfortunate Girls, which is basically just a bunch of disabled kids. It doesn't always specify the disability, at least not in like our modern language, but I think the main character, it seemed like she might have something like EDS, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. We had another character who like I thought quite clearly probably was autistic. There was a character who was a wheelchair user. There was a whole bunch, like basically every character in here, at least at the school that we meet, is disabled. And basically there's quite a nefarious plot involving a wealthy man essentially wanting to like buy these disabled children to experiment on them because he figures that nobody will miss them. Horrible, horrible. And so these disabled girls are basically trying to foil this plot and keep each other safe. And we also got to see how a lot of the adults around these girls perceived them and their disabilities, and in a lot of cases essentially didn't see them as human. So it does tackle like some very explicit ableism and dehumanization around disability, but the fact that it's told from their perspective and essentially they are the heroes of this story, I thought it was really well done. I will say for my taste at least, I loved the like first third, I loved the last third, but the middle third did drag a little bit. I think if it had been a little bit tighter in terms of the plot, I think this could have been one of my new favorite middle grades. It didn't quite get there, but I did have a lot of fun reading it, and I think as far as disability rep in a middle grade book goes, I think this is one of the best I've ever read. Okay, now a book that I know I was like trying to read or had started reading back when I checked in with you in my April wrap up was Terror Story by Hilary Lecter. And I did manage to finish it. How do you explain this book? I mean, Hilary Lecter had wrote one of my favorite books from a couple of years ago called Temporary. That remains one of those kind of books that I just like still think about and I still reference when I'm reading other books. So of course, Hilary Lecter's new book had to be a must buy, must read for me. And this was kind of like weird and strange and kind of like magical realism-y. Honestly, it felt more like bittersweet, I suppose, than Temporary. And I haven't even told you what it's about because it's kind of hard to explain. Basically, we meet a young family who is really struggling financially, and they've hired out a small flat. And all they kind of dream of is having their own outdoor space, whether it's like a balcony or a backyard. One day when they invite like a work friend over, she goes to like one of the cupboards in their house and opens it up. And when she opens it up, it turns out that it's a beautiful, massive terrace. But this terrace is only ever there when this friend is here. And so there is some commentary on like space and our spaces and the spaces that we have access to, and kind of like how much that can affect our well-being and our sense of self. But I can't really tell you much more about the book because it does kind of like, it dives off the deep end. Of course it does. It's Hilary Lecter. I did really like this book. I did not like it as much as Temporary. It didn't kind of like hit me or suck me in the same way as Temporary did. And I suppose I didn't find the resolution or kind of like how it wrapped up as satisfying or as thought-provoking as I did with Temporary. I do want to say in the book's defense that like I said, I did kind of like read, I don't know, like 30 or 40 pages and then kind of put it down because I was struggling to read, and then I just kind of like picked up where I left off, and I was still struggling to read, but I wanted to like push through because like I was liking it. So I don't know if like part of my, I don't know, kind of like mellow response to the book has to do with my own like reading issues, you know? Amazing cover though, and I will still read anything Hilary Lecter puts out next because like there was a lot to like in here, even if it didn't like bowl me over in the same way Temporary did. I think my favorite of the kind of like adult fiction books that I've read though would have to be Diary of a Void by Emi Yagi. I picked up this book a little while ago. Literally, I mean, first I spotted the cover, I liked the cover, but the reason I bought it is because it's blurbed by Kikuku Samura, who wrote There's No Such Thing as an Easy Job, which is one of my favorite books ever. And this was bonkers. This was honestly, I did really like this a lot. I think my only criticism would be that I almost wished it had committed to the bit even more than it did. I wish it had pushed it maybe just that little bit further. I think if it had, it would have been like one of my favorite books of the year. As it stands, I just really had a great time reading it. Basically, the conceit of this book is that we're following a woman, like she's kind of like in her 30s, I think, or 30, around there. She's a single woman. She's the only woman working in her office in Japan. And because of that, she often just kind of like, there's just like an underlying assumption in the office that she takes care of certain jobs, like getting the coffee ready or tidying up the kitchen or like making a cake for whoever's birthday it is, you know, all of those sort of things. She says they weren't on her job description, but somehow they seem to be part of her job description, even if she never agreed to them. One day, there's like a big meeting at work, and so there's like coffee cups all left, dirty coffee cups left in the meeting room. And she just decides she's not cleaning them up today. And finally, at the end of the day, somebody comes up to her and goes like, there's coffee cups in the meeting room. And she's like, yep. And he's like, are you going to clean them up? And she's like, oh no, I can't. And he's like, why? And she's like, because I'm pregnant and the smell will make me sick. Basically, this woman invents a pregnancy to get out of cleaning the coffee cups, but she commits to the bit. She commits to this idea of being pregnant to get out of more and more shit at work. It gets to the point, in fact, where like the lines between like whether this pregnancy is real or not start to be blurred. Like I said, I do wish this book had kind of gone just like one step further. I think I could have like been obsessed with this book if it did. But as it is, I just really enjoyed reading it. I read it in like a day or two, which honestly, a really big achievement for me in the last few months. And it was pretty funny while also having some like interesting commentary on like particularly like feminism and sexism and women in the workplace and all of that good stuff. I think my favorite book of all the books that I have managed to read though would have to be The Seance Tea Party. This is a middle grade graphic novel, and I did originally just borrow it from work to read. We're allowed to just like borrow books for a day or two to read and then return them as long as they're in pristine condition. But I liked it so much that the next day I just bought it. I needed to have a copy for myself. Basically, this is a story about a young girl kind of like on the precipice of puberty and like all of the changes that come with that, kind of going into high school. And she just doesn't really feel ready to grow up yet. So anyway, while this is all happening, essentially her imaginary friend from back when she was a kid shows up again. But it turns out this imaginary friend was never an imaginary friend. She was actually a ghost. The artwork is beautiful, very evocative. I just loved it. Love the colors, all of that good stuff. I would say for the first half of this book, I was having a good time. I was enjoying it, but I wasn't like in it. I wasn't obsessed. But there's a moment about halfway through the book where I don't know, it just hit me like a ton of bricks. And I was like, this is one of my favorite graphic novels of all time. I think it's brilliant. Essentially, without going into it too much, this book really beautifully, tenderly explores concepts around mortality. And in the context of our main character being scared to grow up, we get to know some older people, as well as learning more about our ghost friend. And essentially her experience of like being denied the opportunity to ever grow up is juxtaposed with our main character's experience. So it deals with like grief, but specifically I think it deals with like fear and anxiety about the future and juxtaposing that with mortality. It doesn't feel overdone though. It just, oh my God, I can't tell you how much I loved this. Obsessed, absolutely obsessed. One of my favorite books of the year, one of my favorite graphic novels I've ever read. Amazing. So that is everything that I have managed to read in the last 5 months, which like, I've read some good books, but that is not a lot of reading for somebody who's literally a bookseller, who literally has a booktube channel, and who normally reads an awful lot. I did briefly though want to tell you about some of the books that I've like started and stopped reading. I don't want to say DNF'd because none of these, let me double check. No, none of these was an active decision. It just kind of like happened. You know, a day turns into a week, turns into a month, and all of a sudden I'm not reading the book anymore. And it feels a little like scary or overwhelming to go back to it. I read a very small amount of A Curious Beginning while we were on holiday. I took this one up. I was excited. I thought it would be like the perfect holiday read, but it turns out that the audiobook, at least when I was in Queensland, it like, I know it used to have distribution in Australia, but like it didn't exist in Australia anymore. And as we've established, I have been very reliant on audiobooks. So I sort of like tried to read like a chapter or two of this, and I don't know, it's just like my eyes are like glossing over the words and I'm not taking anything in, which I know it's not, I don't love the fact that I've become reliant on audiobooks, to be perfectly honest. Like I have nothing against audiobooks. I think they're wonderful. I have no judgment on people who only read audiobooks. I'm not one of those like gatekeeper people. But for me, I don't love the fact that I feel reliant on audiobooks. And I tried to read this and I literally couldn't tell you a single thing. I couldn't tell you a single thing from those first couple of chapters. So I decided to give up and I haven't returned to it. I think the next book that I tried was The Familiar by Leigh Bardugo. Do I still have my... No, I think I ended up taking my bookmark out. I think I got like 80 or so pages in. So like a fair chunk. This one I did have the audiobook for. And like I was liking it. I wouldn't be able, like I could not tell you in good faith that I was loving it though. I do think Leigh Bardugo's writing is quite nice. This is the first Leigh Bardugo book I've ever read. So I'm not like a stan coming from her other works to this. This was my first time in. And I did like the kind of like historical fantasy setting, which, you know, has historically worked quite well for me. But I wasn't like super into the characters. And I don't know, it just wasn't doing a huge amount for me. I was interested to see where it was gonna go, but one day I just put it down and then I never picked it up again. And that was months ago. So at this point I sort of feel like I would have to restart it, and I just don't know that I'm willing to do that. Another book that I read quite a chunk of, 80 pages, I read Liar's Test by Amberlynn Quay-Mulliner. Amberlynn Quay-Mulliner is one of my favorite authors. I've read a bunch of her stuff. This is her new release. I was liking this. But what happened with this one is my hold for the audiobook at the library ran out. As I said, reliant on audiobooks over here, so I kind of stopped. And then the most recent addition to my pile, this one, because it's more recent, I do kind of hold out hope that maybe I'll finish it. But like with each passing day, that becomes less and less likely. It is The Night Circus. I have read over 100 pages of this. I'm up to part 2. And actually I stopped reading this at around like 50 pages, but then did manage to pick it up a few weeks later, push through another 50. I've stopped again. This one, I am liking. Again, I'm not in love with it, but like I'm enjoying it. I do think that this is a bit of a funny choice, given that I don't know if you remember back in 2022, I read The Starless Sea, and that ended up being one of my least favorite books of the year. But something in me decided that Erin Morgenstern deserved a second chance with me, and here we are. And I feel like I'm not really showing up to give her a proper second chance. But maybe that's just because I'm not really into the book. I don't know. Like I said, none of these 4 books have been like actively DNF decisions. Like, I don't like this book, I don't want to read this book. It's more of like this apathy and this lack of motivation to read the book or to read in general. But anyway, please keep your fingers crossed for me that this reading slump ends soon. Thanks so much for hanging out with me. A big thank you, as always, goes to Livia, Lynette Brown, and Marie, and a big thank you for you for watching. I will talk to you in the next video. Until then, happy reading. Bye.